Hello, I'm Crotty, and this is my demonstration video for Assessment 4 for ENGG4500 Semester 2 2019. This is my finished product. It's a puzzle for the blind to make the shape of a whale, essentially. And it's a modified Chinese tangram puzzle wherein all the shapes have been changed to be only triangles, and the tile surfaces have been altered to essentially confuse the fully sighted whilst aiding blind people or partially blind people to complete the puzzle more easily and as intended. So first we'll have a look at how we got here. So this first test, I think it became quite obvious that I'd have to make it more difficult for a sighted person, because at the moment it's quite simple for them to identify the markings and go about making the puzzle. So I've decided, I think, that I'll be painting the puzzle later, because painting over the indentations will disguise it, and I could also throw off a sighted person into maybe constructing another shape. Also, it became apparent that there's perhaps too many markings, because even though they completed the puzzle correctly, the sighted person maybe took a little bit too long to do that, and it's going to take even longer for a blind person to recognize each marking. So I think a good way to rectify that would be to lower the number of markings, and I've decided I think I might sand the outside edges of the whale and leave interior cut edges just laser cut. And that's drawing comparisons from the interview with Miss Bizda when she pieced together two bits of packing foam. She realised that there's a machine edge where something should be rounded on the outside perhaps. So I think I'll be doing another paper test with less markings, and I might try to simulate the sanded edge just by shading the edges to see if a sighted person will notice that that's the outline of the whale. Alright, so this second test is slightly different to the first in that it had less markings, and I simulated a sanding the outside edge using shading. Also, rather than just traditional English numbering, we used Braille notation. It was noted in the test that the sighted person could still quite easily match the markings and complete the puzzle. However, they said to me that the Braille made it a bit more difficult because they're not used to seeing such notation, which is a good sign, because that means it's more difficult for a sighted person, and it's probably going to mean that would be easier for a blind person. Given that, or provided the markings were made tactile, it's reasonably assumed that the blind person can do the same job that the sighted person did in recognizing them and matching them. So now the challenge really is to make it more difficult for a sighted person, which we'll be doing during construction through painting. Basically, the puzzle consists of 12 individual laser cut 3mm MDF wooden board pieces. It's quite a sturdy and robust design, so it's quite easy to see it being used upwards of hundreds of times without any sort of critical damage. And the pieces can be arranged to form a square amongst other shapes, and that square is going to be 200mm by 200mm. So in terms of the sort of vague size guidelines, it's quite reasonable. So for the design criteria, I'll just run you through a few points. Firstly, what is it? It's essentially an adaptive tactile tangram puzzle for the blind or visually impaired. And when it's completed, it roughly makes the outline of a whale. Using the puzzle requires both touch and may also use sight. Beyond that, it has a fairly potent smell of charred wood, from the laser cutting, and it's actually quite nice. Not sure about taste, and I probably wouldn't try that. And while sound isn't strictly necessary for completing the puzzle, if you hit the puzzle pieces together, the sound is actually quite pleasant, and it could probably actually be used for a percussive instrument or sound effect in recording if you actually wanted to do that. Some other functions or hidden functionalities can include using the pieces when they're put together as a coaster or a placemat. Each piece can also be used as to rule a straight edge or a right angle. And ignoring the actual function of making the outline of a whale, you can actually rearrange the pieces to make hundreds, potentially thousands of different animals, geometries and shapes as you so choose. For the most part, the largest obstruction to the sighted user is both the paint on the tiles as well as their memory and muscle memory of completing puzzles throughout their life. It was expected that the tactile features would be secondary, if at all, to an attempt to match the colours in some way, as many sighted users would be accustomed to doing jigsaw puzzles wherein the premise is essentially to match colours and create a pattern or a picture or something like that. Also, the paint actually makes it quite tricky to visually identify the tactile markings at all when compared to previously when it wasn't painted. And given that the user is not explicitly told to make the shape of a whale, it's therefore very likely that the sighted user will choose to make another arrangement with the tiles of basically any other shape rather than a whale. Okay, to make it easier to explain the puzzle's design from the perspective of someone who's blind, I'm going to do this part of the video before painting it, as painting only makes it more difficult to see these tactile indicators on the tile surfaces. Basically, each tile piece has been modified with indentations that have been burnt into the surface using a laser machine, and some specific edges have been sanded to make or create a rounded edge. When I say specific edges, I mean only the edges that make up the outline of this whale shape. So if we look at this tile, only these two edges have been rounded or sanded, whereas this edge here has been left comparatively sharper because it's just been laser cut and left. The idea behind that is that the user will identify a cut edge and attempt to match these edges while simultaneously matching these indentation shapes, and maybe they'll also realize that the sanded edge is to create the outline of the shape, as many like regular objects have a rounded outside for safety and comfort of holding. So these markings on the surface consist of a group of triangles of different sizes, some lines, circles, squares, and even some braille numbering. So we have braille numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4, and they're orientated vertically to assist in a blind person orientating the puzzle correctly. However, that actually doesn't really matter. Really, what matters is that they recognize that the shapes are similar, whether it be braille or the triangles or lines or squares, circles, whatever it may be, that they match these with a twin indentation on another tile. And as long as they do that, and combined with the sanding, it'll create the whale shape. So now I'm just going to run you through the methodology or the instructions for completing the puzzle, largely from the perspective of someone who is visually impaired or blind. And again, I'm doing that now before I actually paint the puzzle, because painting it only obscures the tactile modifications that I've put on the surface, so you may not be able to see it if I was to do it once it's painted. So like I identified before, the tactile modifications and features are these triangles, lines, braille numbering, and as well the sanded edges of just the outline of the whale. So basically, yeah, now I'm going to run you through the directions of building it. So if you're presented with all the pieces in front of you, as a blind person, you would most likely just begin to explore the pieces, probably one at a time. You may identify that they're all triangles. You may feel that some of the edges are sharper, sanded, hopefully will. And as you run it over the surface of the tile, you'd feel the various indentations and build up a memory of what indentations you've already felt, what braille you've felt, and then perhaps you'd move back to one piece to begin with. If there's this piece, you may really just feel the indentations first and may remember that you felt lines earlier on another piece. You'd go to explore that piece again, find it again, and perhaps you'd line it up. because that's a natural way to do puzzles. Then you might remember that the number 1 there was in Braille. You'd find that piece, connect it. Then you'd have to maybe start filling around somewhere else. You'd fill these longer triangles, and you remember that you'd only fill them in 2 different places. Maybe you connect them over here separately. Then you maybe try to match these other triangles. You notice that the circles are there, and there's also a circle here. And so it wouldn't go like this based on the circle. You'd have to realize that it goes like this, and find another circle that you might have already remembered. Join that in there. And then by now, hopefully you would have recognized that some edges are sanded whilst others are just cut, or the connecting pieces interior to the whale are sharper. So you might end up on this piece, which has just one sanded edge on the bottom, and there's no indentations along this edge, so you may end up with that piece there. You can then go ahead and match the Braille number 2 with this other number 2, keeping the arrows together. The only other number 3 that you can find is this one here, which can only go just there. Then really there's only one way to extend the puzzle with a marking, and that's this Braille number 4 over here. That's there. And this one's a bit interesting because the sanded edges run from this point here all the way around and stop here. There's only one untouched edge, which is just this cut piece here. Same with this piece, it's just untouched for that edge there. And there's a square indentation, so you can match that up like that to create what is the tail of the whale.